Great.
Excellent.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. I will maximize here. Okay. All right. Hi. Thanks everyone for joining us. I tapped in plenty of you on the shoulder, so if you feel obliged, well, you can oblige me back and whatever else you need to drag me into next. It happens fairly regularly, so I have no real sympathy for you all. Okay, so this is the social science interest groups meeting for Plenary 20. Part of the reason we tried to sort of bring as many people into the room as we could was this is a where to next discussion. And so the aim of today is really going to be a bit of a sense of we've been together since it was Botswana.
Yeah,
with the first effort for putting together a social science data interest group that came together. And as I say, it's now time to take stock and see where we've come to, and in a sense, where to next. Is there a sort of interest in continuing the interest group, what that group might do, and the orientation. So we're going to do today a bit of an overview of, in a sense, where we've been, and what's the purpose of the group itself. What we were trying to do early on with this group. And how far we've gone and actually be able to address some of those aims, and a bit of a Q&A there. So that's sort of the first half of the session is where have we been so far, to give you a sense of where we've got to. But really the second half of the session is very much about, well, we've actually done quite a lot of what we set out to achieve originally. So this is a sort of a refocusing discussion. It's actually the second time we've run this type of session. In fact, we tried that in Korea as well. It didn't work so well in Korea, say, just as a function of the timing. I managed to catch COVID right in the middle of so I wasn't there, and others were as well. So the aim of today really is to sort of set some directions for where this interest group might go next, bring together a group of people who might be interested in looking at this going forward, and to sort of further discussion. So by way of introduction, I'm Steve McEachran, the Director of the Australian Data Archive, and I have a role in various other things as well. John, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jonathan Crabtree with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I work at the Odom Institute managing the Research Data Infrastructure Group.
Yeah. Our third chair, Ron Decker, was one of the original co-chairs as well. We're going to come back to that. Ron finished up his term as the director at this time last year, and so one of the discussions we're keen to engage in as well as sort of new co-chairs for the group as well, and that's part of the discussion. So as I said, what we're trying to do today is certainly give a sense of where we've been, what have we achieved, and what would we like to do next in this interest group. And certainly, bring together a new group to sort of further that discussion. Okay, so we do have a bit of a slideshow to begin with, and say in the first half of the session will really be focused on that. But continuing on from there, so what we're really looking for is what sorts of things continue to be of interest to those with a sort of a related interest in social science and humanities research data. Okay. All right, so some of the inspiration for this group was, in fact, let's say John and I just sort of briefly mentioned our roles, but let's say as many of us have in these sorts of spaces, we actually have multiple hats. It sort of started from an opportunity to bring together three groups that actually have a fairly large involvement in the support for social science data internationally. And those three groups were, so Ron was the chair of the Consortium of European Social Science Data Archives. We have a number of those people from those groups represented in the room. I was at the time the chair of the Data Documentation Initiative, which is probably the prominent social science metadata standard. And John is the chair of the International Federation of Data Organisations, IFDU. And our interest here was we have three fairly strong, well-established organisations who have an interest in, continuing to think about the role of social science data and social science data infrastructure. what could we achieve by actually trying to coordinate, some of that activity between three organisations who had a long-standing role. So DDI had been around since the late 90s, CESDA in various forms, and IFDU as well since the 1970s. So there's a long history of sort of this international coordination that exists in the social sciences. So part of our thinking was we've been, and John and I both have an executive role with IFDU as well, looking at sort of migrating that role. There was some question as to what we might do next, particularly with IFDU, and how that might, perhaps be better supported through, in fact, the Research Data Alliance. So the three organisations came together to further that discussion in Botswana. Could we use, RDA to actually focus our efforts and collaborate more on activities related to social science data internationally? So in Botswana, we held initial birds of a feather session, and at the time we were asked by the TAB, the Technical Advisory Board, to think about actually being a little bit broader in focus. So actually a social sciences and humanities interest group application. Now I think at the next session in Philadelphia, we tried to bring together a couple other groups. There were some active, some groups that were somewhat active at that point in time. There was a linguistics group, and there was also a humanities. I'm trying to think of what the specific focus of that group was. There was a humanities data group that was there, focused in a particular digital humanities field. Right? Suffice to say, the efforts that the engagement that we had with those groups, we found that there probably wasn't sufficient common interest to look at a social science and humanities interest group broadly. Instead, we actually refocused in the end to just focus on a social sciences interest group from there. As a result of that, RDA approved the charter of the Social Science Research Data Group, and we were endorsed in 2019. And so coming out of that stage. So in that charter that we established, there were three core themes that we were really trying to focus on in the first 3 years of operation. So coming out of Botswana and Philadelphia, I'd like to say those three themes were: one was quality of data, so finding automated ways to investigate it and provide information on data quality. The second was around data policy, so trying to align and wherever simplify data policies and their implications for making data available, for using data. And thirdly, an emphasis on sensitive data. So estimates around 40% of the data in our community is too sensitive to make them openly available. Social sciences has a strong influence of, not closed data, but restricted. We have to think about the process of restricted, and some of you, I'm already working with you, and John has been working on trusted repositories for sensitive data as well. So these three things were clearly coming through, in the discussions that that we had going on. The too open to make them openly available without any restrictions or measures was the kind of the three themes there. So data quality, data policy, sensitive data, kind of the working activities, and that's, as I say, that set us up in mid 2019 as to sort of the three themes that were there. Okay, so from there, essentially what we were then looking towards was sort of a program of activities feeding over that time. So of course here, and so COVID becomes an important part of this story at this point. So we had our first formal meeting as an endorsed interest group in Helsinki in Plenary 14. And that was actually around connecting communities and an open discussion on data quality. And we'll come back to some feedback on each of these sessions over that period as we go through. So data quality hitting our first theme at our first interest group. We actually had pulled together, and say this become a session on sensitive data in Melbourne. And there was also an additional joint session on metadata requirements for data quality in Melbourne as well. And this was the cancelled session. Melbourne's actually my hometown, so I was looking forward to not having to travel 36 hours to attend an RDA session, and it turns out that it was cancelled. As I think as Hillary was flying into Melbourne, was in fact the point at which that was cancelled. So we had, we were starting to progress towards, certainly revisiting, continuing our discussion on data quality and engaging in sensitive data as we went through. Progressing through, we've continued to have meetings through on plenaries 17 and 18. We didn't put something forward for Costa Rica in the second half of 2020. Just the practicalities of that didn't actually work out. But so we've continued a sensitive data interest group, and I'll come back to sort of how that group's continue to develop. Second session on data quality coming into plenary 18. And then we started to say, given sort of the work we'd done over that period and the establishment that we got in place, we were starting to already think about sort of, where are we going to by the time we got to Seoul in, that was June last year, in fact. Now, the aim of this group hasn't been to, we're not a working group. It's continued to be, and we've always had as an intent here, trying to focus on building relationships so that we can provide input into engaging in working groups. That's always been the intent. So that, where we can find points of engagement, we would do so. Sort of an opportunity for the those with an interest in this area to kind of come together and provide a touch point for collaborative groups across ADA to be able to engage with those who might be working in social science data, and then build those into working groups as we would go through. And that's continued to be sort of part of the discussion as we've gone through. And saying that has actually turned out to be quite a successful part of our approach. So there are no formal outputs of this interest group in and of itself. What we're trying to do instead is kind of build those relationships to get some working group outputs as we've gone through. So that's kind of where we find ourselves. That's how we've developed over the period of the last 3 years. And so what we wanted to do then is say, okay, at this point in time, we've been established, essentially for 3 years. So we were coming through in 2022. The cycle was, seemed to be about right. Now's the time to revisit some of the focus of what the interest group establishes. It's sort of its 3 key areas of interest, and say, okay, what might be coming next? How are we going relative to that original charter? Is there an opportunity to refocus the charter somewhat, and then think about what might be the next areas of collaboration and interest that would be relevant to those working in this community. Again, trying to think about this as a means for coordinating quite a lot of sort of high-level umbrella groups that actually work together already in this domain dedicated to the social sciences themselves. So that's kind of the framework for where we've come from. What we want to do now is to do a little bit of an overview of where, so what have we achieved in some of these areas, back to those 3 original aims of the charter. Okay, I realise I haven't got some water here with me. I see a water jug there anyway.
There's one back here.
Oh, fantastic, thanks guys. Okay, so further to say, we haven't done a formal session on data policy itself. We've always had a long-term interest in this area, but at the time, early on in the piece, we thought, well, there's probably a forum for thinking about where data policy and social science data policy might go forward. As it's developed, though, our sense has been essentially that hasn't been necessary. Curiously, what's essentially actually started to emerge is an emphasis on a lot of the policies really coming out of RDA itself. Is there a need specifically for a focus on social science data policy? Our sense has been no, not really. Now others may vary in terms of their view there, but the policy environment that's emerged between some of the larger groups and coming out of some of the national and international efforts as well, probably has provided sufficient guidance there that we as we've gone through, we haven't put a whole lot of emphasis into that space. Now, this could be something we could continue to return to, but our sense in kind of working out, through this process has been that it's probably not been necessary, to continue that. RDA, Cytotocon, the sorts of, international efforts that are going on probably provide sufficient, sort of focus for that. And to try and, build something specific there seemed probably, less than relevant. And we've actually seen that actually reflected in some of the working groups that have occurred in the in RDA and other spaces as well. So there was in fact a social sciences, a COVID-19 social sciences working group that came out of activities in this area. We didn't have a direct involvement in that, but those related colleagues have been fairly active in this space. So the Fair Sharing Registry Working Group covers a lot of the social science infrastructures and national and local repositories that exist as well. And we've had certainly data standardisation and implementation interest groups. So we think that's probably sufficiently covered. So while we might have done more in that area, it's probably the case that it really wasn't necessary to do a whole lot more. I'm going to continue kind of working through here, but if you have any questions, comments as we go through on each of these, that would also be helpful here. If you disagree, say the point being is we're trying to think about where to next. So if you do disagree, you think there's more to be done here, I'm more than happy to take comments, but we'll be certainly throwing it open for discussion later in the piece as well. All right. Secondly, though, certainly sensitive data is kind of the second theme that was here, and we sort of commented on the fact that again, this point was building awareness, building an understanding of the relevance of social science, and the sort of the key priorities there was sensitive data was clearly going to be part of our remit. Now, so that in fact, as I say, we were approached by colleagues to look at involvement in the social science, what was being established as the sensitive data interest group. So that sensitive data interest group covers quite a lot of domains, but again, that sort of providing that touch point as an interest group allowed us to sort of engage in the sensitive data interest group meeting, the initial birds of a feather meeting, and progressively the establishment of that interest group as well. So we did contribute to the charter development and say co-chairing the interest group. I mean, I am a co-chair of that group, but I say that's been nicely has actually led to a broader collaboration. There are sort of 9 or 10 co-chairs. Darren.
So I don't mean to split hairs, but when we say sensitive, are we implying that that's disclosive data as well?
They
are two quite different.
Now, interestingly, that's a good. So let me just quickly reflect upon what the sensitive data interest group has has focused on, because I think that starts. What ought to we be covering as we're okay across domain?
I didn't know, is that controversial?
No. So the questions of how to think about cross-domain sensitive data have been actually sort of a core part of that group. I'm going to kind of reflect on that in just a moment. So I think that within what we think about here, that's certainly part of it. But thinking about it more broadly and actually trying to look at it, sort of a shared understanding and a vocabulary for sensitive data has actually been one of the key.
And then there's confidential as well, which if you talk to Matthew, he'll
so you start to get into, there are some, again, there's some social science specific sort of questions there. We have folks from the life sciences, we actually have from, the environmental sciences and so forth, kind of coming into the mix here. So I've got a little bit more on that, on the charter of that group in a moment, Limmel.
Yeah, sorry, I also have a clarification question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't raise it before, but about the data policy, are you referring to data policies of institutions or all kinds of data policies?
We were more thinking about sort of national and sort of almost cross-national, let's say, with data policy, because given the original group that was involved, so we were really looking here primarily at those that might be trying to work in a sense across multiple organisations, often across multiple countries. So CESDA, IFDU, and DDI were all working at that sort of multi-organisational level. So we weren't really looking within institutions. It was really trying to understand where the involvement might be at sort of a national and even a multinational level there, because we were already, in a sense, that was the space we were, that we were already playing in. Which does, of course, then potentially flow down into impacts on institutional policy, but looking directly at institutional policies, no, not so much. Okay. So within this sensitive data group, as I say, that's that sensitive data interest group is now pretty active, and if you're interested in that particular group, it's meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. So it's in the first session tomorrow morning, and actually the sort of one of the theme for tomorrow is really looking across the domains, actually, and looking at some of those sort of common or varied understandings of sensitivity, and as I say, one of the efforts within that group has also been to try and start establishing a vocabulary of common terms used in managing of sensitive data writ large, and it has in a sense extended to beyond as I particularly in some of the social sites we do really focus on confidentiality, privacy, disclosure risk as kind of the sort of the core issues there. We do get into some other spaces as well, but things like commercial sensitivity, we've got the health sciences and the like coming into the mix there. So that, as I say, the sensitive data interest group has actually been working on this building this sort of vocabulary of terms, a bottom-up building of a sort of a vocabulary for different framings of where we think about common terms are being used in management of sensitive data. It's kind of early days yet for that, but to say that survey of some of those common terms has been building progressively, and so we've got a nice mix of domains coming to the mix there. The remit for that group: developing a clear understanding of the different levels of sensitivity of data and impacts on governance frameworks. Establish protocols for researchers to collect, analyse, store and share reused data with different types of sensitivity. Providing guidelines of balancing FAIR principles with other sensitive data management principles, such as the CARE principles. Formulating strategies for overcoming barriers to utilising, sharing and reusing sensitive data, and getting most of that can out of sensitive data assets. Guidelines for ethical sharing and reuse, and consent models around the primary and secondary use of data. I would say that there certainly has been a challenge within that group of common language. It was clearly, and that's why in fact the sort of the primary activity has been in the last couple of meetings around building that sort of common terms, common language framing that's coming through. So we have both the cross-domain challenges and the cross-jurisdiction challenges that come from thinking about sensitive data in these communities as well. So what does GDPR bring versus HIPAA in the States versus other frameworks that might exist in Australia and elsewhere? Has been quite a sound exercise. Okay, so that group, as I say, really has continued to develop. The sensitive data interest group itself now has had some collaborative presentations, one of them coming from Sushi Obama from Health Data UK, and some very interesting work going on, sort of cross-domain sensitive data management and infrastructure development in the UK from DARE. I know, Darryl, what does DARE stand for?
Data Analytics Research Environments.
Yeah, which is really looking at administrative data, health data, and in a sense trusted research environments across domains in the UK. The big program of work that's kind of being developed there, and so she was involved sort of the precursor work for that. And then, as I said, this sort of shared community definitions, vocabularies. That was the emphasis of the last session, sort of certainly building a set of community definitions, vocabularies. There's actually been a survey, a term survey that's gone out to the community, a summary of sort of the current vocabulary work that's been going on, and really trying to build up a sensitive data glossary. There is an interesting question there that starts for those of us who work in vocabularies and glossaries as to how do we formalise and standardise and manage those. I think that's work to be done, but we do have some folks who work pretty actively in the vocabulary management space, not just from social sciences, but people like Roman David from Elixir and elsewhere. That I think that will continue to develop. So it's been, as I said, so we've sort of worked our way through two of the sort of 2 of our emphases here. We've been through certainly starting with the data policy. Sensitive data management, we've continued to progress there. Realistically, a lot of the work at an RDA, sort of an umbrella level, now we think is going to continue probably into working collaboratively in the sensitive data interest group and some working groups that might flow from there. Okay.
Steve, we have a question in the chat on the sensitive data that ask is how is the possibility of change of sensitive data over time being managed by this group or taken into account as time goes on, things become either more or less sensitive?
Yeah, that's probably a good one to bring back to that's a good one we can take to the group tomorrow. In fact, how do you manage the sensitivity of data as it varies over time? Is one we can kind of take to the discussion, I think. I think
in addition to this, you also have a problem of legacy data that at the time when it was deposited was, let's say, on the right side of the law. But there's a huge curation backlog to follow up on whether that's still the case. So that's sort of allied to the same question. It's actually an ongoing curation task to understand what legal and other sensitive data regulations may impact your collection. And every time it changes, you have to go and check everything again.
Yes, and going back and thinking about, and saying this is where that sort of non-standard terminology has actually been quite problematic, in fact, is that, in fact, what are we even comparing? So that's, as I say, and that's in fact why the focus of that group has started with just, looking into trying to standardise some terminology. I think there's more work to be done there, but it's obviously a starting point at least. So that, as I say, I mean, I think fundamentally that's kind of where we've come to ourselves in the sort of the sensitive data group. As I say, we think we've been able to get some active work going on there for and spaces for collaboration there, and we'll continue to be involved in that, and we'll have some suggestions for going forward. But that's kind of where we found ourselves really on the sensitive data side. As I say, we continue to think that there'll be work to be done there, but so whether that should be led out of the social science group or really being driven through the sensitive data group is probably a question to come back to as we go forward. So then the last part of that, the last of our themes here has then really been around data quality. And this, as I say, we've run 2 sessions, in fact, in Helsinki and then in the virtual meeting in 2021, actually oriented around data quality. And some of those in this room were actually presented, as part of those discussions. And sort of there's a long history of certainly looking at sort of data quality, or certainly fitness for purpose and fitness for use questions in the social sciences. So our first of our meetings was really orienting around questions around how might we start looking at assessment of social science research data quality and possible partners for an outreach program that might exist there. Is there a cross-domain effort? And I was kind of working my way through some of the interest and working groups. It sort of pops up, not just pops up. There's active efforts in different spaces here, but there's not a lot of coordination again that seems to occur sort of across domain in this area at an RDA level. So within this, sort of the Helsinki meeting, we had John talking about data curation for reproducibility based upon the work that the team at Odom do with the political science community. They're pretty active, reproducible, and you've got a new term for it, haven't you? Even re-executable. What's the terminology that you use?
So another thing that we also we spun off Lynn Moore's group here at RDA doing this exact thing. So that's what was really nice about the early days of this, is how we thought about things and worked through things. So we started talking about reproducibility, and now we have a reproducibility working group here.
Yeah. So I'm certainly fed into some of the early discussions there. Ingrid Dillo talking about some of the fair work that was going on with social science data, and Ron Decker was certainly talking about efforts for thinking, and managing data quality in the CESDA community as well, and what might inform some of the efforts there. Certainly working through sort of metadata requirements, and one of the key themes that certainly came through there was metadata quality is as much the conversation as data quality. Data, the data itself, and the logical structures of the data are actually relatively well understood. It often comes down really to a question of metadata quality that's being received, and some of the efforts that CESDA had gone through to certainly standardise some of those metadata profiles in that community was informative there, and some of the challenges they've had in fact doing so. In terms of looking at common metadata profiles over across the CESDA community, was kind of an interesting reflection of that. But certainly, some of the themes that were coming through there, and where we saw some of the efforts and the relevant efforts that might contribute there, coming out of Core Trust Shield, looking at trustworthy data repositories and the sort of assessment processes that those Core Trust Shield repositories certainly supported. The precursor to the Core Trust Seal, the Data Seal of Approval, was an effort really from DUNS and the social science domains, and was a condition of entry, in fact, of the any archive into the CESDA service provider model. Efforts coming through the data documentation initiative and the data lifecycle model that came, that was established there. This is kind of the foundation model of the DDI version 3, and the sort of the flow of the model and how we manage data and metadata across that lifecycle. Building of metadata and building of data quality across that life cycle, the leveraging of metadata profiles to be able to reuse metadata as well, that form part of the life cycle model for DDI as well. Things like studies, questions, variables and values, and that's informed, in fact, a continuing effort, the next version of which is the cross-domain integration that continues this effort. If you want to know more about that one, we're still taking invitations for that, I don't know. On Friday afternoon, there's an introduction to...
There's space here.
There is still space. So if you're interested more in that, Friday afternoon, the GDI, CDI introduction is available for those who are interested in this space. That's informed other efforts as well now. Say a number of those in this room involved in the World Fair program. We have particularly in the I believe your work package within that around social surveys, and essentially it's a story of metadata quality and metadata reuse. Certainly others are involved in similar projects as well. And then we have some, so that's kind of ex ante, ex post, some themes around metadata checking. This was the work that was actually going on with CESDA as well. How do they go through, and when you're receiving metadata from a partner organisation, quality control on the after the fact, and looking at sort of the post processing that occurs there, and that's continued to evolve within the CESDA community. And you also get that in fact with sort of the management of microdata. which is done by both archives and official statistics community as well, and some of the registries of microdata. Then there aren't many, but to say that be able to build some of those variable and other metadata registries sort of is a key driver of interest for the social science community for interoperability purposes. So that was sort of the metadata quality meeting one. The second meeting then really, we obviously had COVID hit us in 2020, so we certainly had some strong initial interest, and there was. I'll come back to this in just a moment about the meeting that never was, and that becomes important in this story. Because COVID particularly hampered, sort of some efforts that we were certainly working towards there. So we kind of had to restart some things a little bit in 2021. In fact, revisiting, data quality and re-engaging in that discussion. So Lemore actually presented on the Cure Fair work that was happening in some of her work. We had, I presented a little bit on the ISSP, the International Social Survey Program. We revisited some of the metadata quality questions that are in CESDA and FSD and FAIR's FAIR, and then continued that sort of discussion around quality metadata. What we were trying to do was certainly conceptualization and definition of what metadata and data quality might mean, and I think this is kind of where we've come to. What are some of those dimensions of data and metadata quality that we can explore and really looking to, and this is the question I think for next steps for us, is there a basis for a working group on data quality within and across domains? I've contributed to a couple of efforts, in fact, not at the RDA meetings, but in the SciDataCon meetings where there has been certainly an interest there. But picking this up as a theme and is one I think that we're interested in exploring further, probably as part of our continuing efforts. We think there's probably sort of a basis for doing a couple of bits, some extra work here. Again, sort of looking at building conceptual papers around how might we define data and metadata quality. What might we consider as dimensions of data and metadata quality is probably part of the effort that we would be interested in being involved with. But we probably expect that that's likely to be through a working group activity. As I said, there's an interest group. We're trying to provide sort of a coordinated discussion. The working groups are where the active work is intended to happen. That's the overall structure of RDA, and we do think bringing together a working group with sort of across domains really is probably helpful here. This really starts to pick up from what we were looking to do, in fact, in Melbourne in 2020. So I was thinking back 3 years, curiously, but to say it's interesting to reflect upon where we had intended to be. So this was actually the group that was interested in coming together back in Melbourne in 2020, and we think this is probably a basis for going forward. Towards metadata requirements for data quality assessment joint meeting was the group that had come together here. It was from this group, but also from a joint WDS RDA assessment of data fitness working group and the Fair Data Maturity working group, which has kind of finished a lot of its efforts. Well, certainly as a working group, that activity closed down. And so what we were coming to there, what is the basis of data quality assessment in disciplinary and cross-disciplinary contexts? Very interesting to look at how different communities think about data quality. If you're all running remote sensing and you're bringing things off remote sensing environments and running things entirely through machine-based systems, it's quite a different sort of experience for being able to assess data quality and the pipeline of data processing relative to running surveys in very interesting places and with very interesting experiences. The processes are different.
Yeah, just I mean, one of the concerns I have is that especially when it comes to data quality, there's a lot of work in domain communities that is not visible in RDA. And I'm afraid that there's a danger of running off in all kinds of directions that's got no connection to the community. I mean, institutions like GEO in Earth and Environmental Observation has been talking about how to encode and describe data quality consistently now for many, many years, and the processes are well established. And I can imagine it's the same in other domains.
Yeah, and this is sort of the point we were kind of getting, and this is why it was rather frustrating to say this was the intent of trying to bring that conversation together. And we say, and going back and reflecting, we realised that that's, you know, there is a need for that cross-domain discussion actually to occur. In the social sciences, actually the data quality discussion has really not come from it's not come from the research community, actually. It's come from the statistics community, is really where that effort has come from. If you go to, you know, Statistics Canada, in my case, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, there is actually reference models actually for talking about data quality that exist. How do we start, you know, and to say it's likely to be the case that we can, you know, look at some of those those domain efforts and start thinking about what the cross-domain requirements are. But they're certainly coming from quite different sorts of discussions, but our sense is there probably is a need to feed into one of those cross-domain, you know, engagements. The question is what that might start to look like, of course. But I think that's probably
No, so just to follow up on that, I think the need is there for, let's say, understanding how to harmonize metadata describing quality across these different domains. But the people who are busy in their respective disciplines of that work, one needs to somehow involve them here in RDA, because otherwise, so the Global Ocean Observing System, just as one example, they've got a hugely elaborate definition of all the variables they measure, what frequency, what level of accuracy and reproducibility is needed to be able to feed climate models. All of that work's already been done and it's in metadata. So there's a disconnect, I think, between this necessary effort here and what is already established in many disciplines.
Yeah, and it's quite varied, and I think it's a little bit of a function of the sort of effort, actually the workflow that exists in the collection and management of data within those systems. Right? You know, you can kind of see being an interesting part of that discussion.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether we're already entering into discussion.
No, I say we're more than happy to engage at the same.
But at this point, because, well, so I'm Ingmel, I'm from GISIS, Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Cologne, Germany, but I'm Norwegian background. But in any case, so think about, so we have put data quality as one of our top priorities, but we're looking at it from a different kind of perspective, because we say we have three different areas. So we have research data management, we have substantial research, and we have software development. So what does it mean for a social science institute if you look at data quality? So then we don't look across domains because of that issue that was raised with all the requirements. But to us, it's much more important, what do we do with, well, what do we need in future with regard to the software to link data, with the response rates and survey data, which has been our core kind of business till now. And obviously the research questions of the grand challenges of today require a completely different access. I do, coming from the research side. So I'm a researcher. So my approach to the data quality, I think, is pretty different than what I've heard so far with regard, of course you need that, but it's so much broader. And I'm a little bit afraid if we discuss social science, data quality, and we stay here, we lose what we need in order to actually provide the social science research community for their research in future. That's just...
I think there'll be a couple of actual reactions to that term, the crowd. Arafat, do you want to pick one up?
Yeah, interestingly, I think the key to that in many ways is building on the work that the Fair Data Maturity Model did, that evaluation of fairness is a pretty big topic right now in a lot of domains. And that's an area where you could focus people on the cross-domain issues and the linkability issues that are really independent of the domain specifics. And I think that it wouldn't be hard to get a discussion and engagement in quality measured in that way, so fair evaluation. And I think there's a lot of interest there. But that maybe that's a good focus because of the danger of engaging too much in domain specifics and losing, you get people from different communities to come together and begin to get a sense of what that was for the sort of grand challenges research that you mentioned. Just an idea. I mean,
my sense is it's kind of both is probably what's likely. There is a need for all out of those cross-domain requirements that are there, but within the, say I work in social science research centre as well, in my spare time, which is there's plenty of it. But these are the sorts of questions that certainly emerge there. But that interaction between how do we think about sort of those cross-domain problems relative to the within domain, how do we actually specify data quality within domain, or actually within particular parts or domains as well, becomes part of the equation there.
Yeah, and I think, so I'm Andrew Hoffman, I'm a data steward at Leiden University, and I work with two institutes where probably 60 to 75% of data that's coming out is based on qualitative, especially ethnographic and interpretivist data. And so when I hear suggestions that we can sort of jump to the cross-domain without needing to worry about domain specificity, and there's not even an agreement within the domain what quality actually is, for example, in anthropology, that at least in the Netherlands, the researchers that I work with feel directly under attack by whether it's statistics communities in the social sciences or whether it's psychology, which is a behavioral science and in our country is often grouped together with social sciences in a single faculty. There's a lot of work to be done in lots of different places before we jump there. And so having said that and heard everything that's talked about here, I think that jumping there is okay, but if we do that, we should be very aware of the risks of continuing to exclude some voices that feel quite oppressed by a lot of the recommendations that are coming out of this community and a lot of the policies that pick that up and interpret in different ways as well, which is also a plea to get back to the policy conversation. I won't do that right now, but I think, again, starting with, we should look at who's not in the room and actually focus some of our efforts exactly on there so that as a data steward, I have useful things to deliver to my researchers, which I generally feel like I lack right now when it comes to a lot of this, especially fair maturity.
Can I respond to that? I think the problem with the fair maturity models is exactly that they fail to understand the domains. And I think that's a focus within that discussion right now is how do we better achieve domain sensitivity? And so I think I think we're sort of coming at the same issue from different sides. I think FAIR is a vehicle for better encouraging that discussion with input from the domains. At least that's how I'd like to see it take place. That's possible.
Because it's addressing the important points. So you have a starting.
Exactly.
So I was going to save this question for the end because it's a little at a different level, but I think it comes directly from the conversation we're having now. One of the objectives, as was thought of this group, was to amplify the participation and impact of the social sciences across RDA, and you've articulated that. But I'm wondering if you think we've succeeded yet. As we said, there's a lot of people not here. The social science participation is still relatively low, and it's a difficult period to have assessed that over, given what's happened the last 3 years. But I would think that the assessment of have we moved the dial? Yes, in certain areas, absolutely, but broadly, are the social sciences better represented? Is their voice impacting the direction of RDA? Are there missing voices that are now participating? And if not, is one of the objectives of this group to do that? And if so, how so? We want to make a level question I'd like to come to something.
I've got to absorb that question. I think that's how to think about where that impact has actually occurred is a pretty interesting question for engagement, actually. The question there, and then I'll follow up there. Yep. Nelson.
You mentioned in a previous slide the working group within the COVID-19 working group.
Yeah.
That was a very active social science group.
Yeah.
And how much what has been produced by that group, which is clearly identified in the recommendations, is useful for the work of the group now, I wonder.
Yeah, so I think we have to go back and actually kind of revisit that. As I mean, that happened entirely independent. I mean, I know some of the people who were in the group, the COVID group itself, but because that happened so quickly, that was a very, very rapid process that, we kind of haven't gone back and, reflected on, quite where that, what the outcomes of that work were, and how that brings that together. That might, in a sense, touch a little bit on the question you were just asking, which is where is those, those points of engagement, where have they occurred? What's not there yet? And that is actually, in a sense, where we do want to kind of look to next. In fact, is what isn't there. What's the next bit of next space to kind of be thinking about moving into? I think you had a comment.
Yeah, and I think it's a follow-up to that, which is not just what voices maybe are not around, but also the ways in which the voices that are around sort of shape what's actually deemed tractable and the things that are latched onto, as far as what I've heard today, where again we said, well, we haven't really dealt with policy because that's already being dealt with in other places, but we've attached on to things like sensitivity, which in my view already kind of jumps into this cross-domain model where, again, within the domains themselves, that question is very much an open question and not settled, at least from my myopic point of view of dealing with anthropologists and interpretivist researchers. So not just to think, whose voice is, but also the ways in which our own voices kind of construct the tractability that are of the problems that then draw on the existing tools themselves, and whether we need to think about what tools we can even envision from the ground up. And maybe that's even more meta than what you were getting at, but hopefully.
So, just a second, Simon, I'll just quickly make a comment on that, as someone who, I have sort of active work going on, and again, a number of the archives and other spaces are actually, looking at sort of qualitative data content, qualitative domains, broadly speaking, and have done for quite a number of years. Again, but it's not prominent, I think, in the work, because it is that much harder problem. In fact, say numbers are easy, or easier. Let's not say they're easy, but how do you, but those active discussions and surfacing those active discussions, I think it might be one of the questions we come to today. So we've got a couple of ideas of what might be possible and what might be areas that people want to pick up on. But it's among, it's from this group and then the broader, community that but that requires active participation as well. So part of what we want to do is surface what are those things that that people would like to do next. That we wanted to sort of facilitate that discussion for today. So that might be one of those things, certainly. I say someone who I'm working with a team in Australia directly on this, for example. Simon.
Simon Hudson, co-leader. Just 4 thoughts to get back to the sort of topic. I mean, but I think that's necessary then to discuss, who's in the room and who's not. There are different issues with quality. First of all, quality of metadata. To what extent we address the FAIR principles. There's a lot of work going on about fair assessment in various ways. Not convinced that that's a useful avenue for this interest group at this point because of how much other work there is going on. Unless we feel there's a space for a particular social sciences view on that. I mean, and Arif and rightly said that we need to be more domain sensitive, but there will be work in welfare in relation to that. Second point is data quality from a social science perspective, and in particular in relation to the push from statistics and other domains. I think that's really, really interesting. I think if there's appetite, it is something that an interest group like this could do, in particular in relation to what is the drive from the statistical community, from the data aggregation community elsewhere, that makes us, that requires us to think about the quality of the data which is being collected and then aggregated into indicators. Big topic, very, very important. Third point is that in relation, you could imagine then some really useful work. Okay, what can a given domain learn from other domains in their thinking about data quality? In a lot of our work in CoData, we hear a lot from international scientific unions or from their representatives that, okay, fair principles, fine, great, ethical principles, fine, but we're not talking enough about data quality. Really important topic, but how do we do that within our domain? Now, you would have thought they'd have an answer to that, but it's a challenge. And again, what can we learn from other subject areas, other domains? The fourth minor point is that in the CODATA International Data Policy Committee, Hans Pfeffenberger has proposed an activity there from a policy perspective, and what can we say from a policy perspective about data quality or fitness for use. He's been using a different term which escapes me for the time being. But I mean, I think it was worth throwing those 4 ideas out, and I think if there's a space for this group, then it's in the second of those. Would seem to be where there's a space for useful work. But I'd be really keen on watching for a transition into the third point and the comparison across domains.
Yeah, and I guess that's, say we haven't had a working group activity in a sense from this group, and that was, so what I'm hearing, sort of in this space is there's, is there an interest in an effort around data quality in the social sciences? As a, and so we kind of have a couple of ideas for what that might look like. What the coordination effort between the domain, we wouldn't want to run a multi-domain thing. We would want to feed into an effort that is likely to be a multi-domain effort. Seems to be the conversation that's there. And again, that kind of fits with that sort of, framing that we were kind of thinking of, which is we contribute to those sort of joint efforts where we can, and then focus on specifically social science domain questions within this, this interest group. And we possibly spin up, specific working groups from that.
Point of clarification,
Yeah.
Steve. You mentioned that some of this work in this group around data quality, and I guess this is more assessment of data quality, sprung from the official statistics side with DCAP and some of the quality frameworks they have, the Eurostat one. And I would observe, having worked with those a lot, that I don't think a researcher would be particularly interested in any of it. Those quality frameworks are really from the perspective of large-scale ongoing data producers and how to manage a network of those people. And I think when you're looking at the kind of quality that's important to research, non-response, these kinds of things, those don't appear anywhere in those quality frameworks, so maybe in a marginal way. And so what is the connection between that idea of data evaluation in official statistics and the kind of what would be useful in the social sciences to researchers? Where is the common ground there? And is that something that's still lurking behind this thinking?
Possibly. I mean, I would say my quick reflection on the official statistics discussion is that it's very high level. As, its usability is actually relatively low. You're getting a quality statement which actually doesn't have any.
You get an assertion at a high level.
Yeah. So as I say, while the starting points are there, the frame, and the framing is there. It's very, high level and doesn't dig into the detail. And then I've seen that play out in the Australian case with this, the Australian quality framework, which is what's kind of the point? There's a box checking exercise essentially to say, well, this is broadly speaking what the issues are. How usability? Would that be a benefit?
And I just want to add on to this. So I think about social science research takes place in so many areas, in so many, as I said this morning, at the Plenary and NGOs. And if you look at, and they do research. This is where a lot of the university educated social science, which is a huge number of disciplines with a lot of quantitative mix, whatever. And I think they could really profit from a lot of the work the RDA is doing. But it's silos. They, in my business, know, if I talk about what I'm doing here, they are lost immediately. So it's a way of also getting into the communication. So, but the thing is, this is used for policy, for evidence-based policy implementation. So it has a wide range of consequences. They get the money, public money. They don't share because they cannot share, because they have no idea about RDM. Then the quality, and then they draw conclusions on that basis. Politicians don't care. They get more money. And you can just, I get so frustrated. So if there's any way, you can get recommendations communicated in a clear way, and also to make them share so that you have a way of actually assessing the results they have, that they then publish in the reports, because you don't get the data. And of course, they don't give it to you because they partly don't know what they've done themselves. So I think if we want to make a big impact, we could do a lot of the social science interest group within our community with regard to all that is basically already known.
Yeah, look, as someone, as I said, my actual, chief hat is director of a data archive. So, that's and I have the very similar sort of profile. About a third to 40% of our users are in the government and NGO space. So that sort of engagement there, and the policy impact side of that becomes really very interesting part of that equation.
Yes, I think in all of this, the useful distinction is exactly this difference between process quality, which is sort of agnostic of final application in a way, because a lot of it has to do whether the instruments were calibrated correctly and whether you did the same analysis 10 times and you have a confidence interval and so on, versus fitness for use, because that is a property of the relation between the data set or the object and the person or the process that is applying it. And that's different for each process or person applying that data. There may be some generic properties for a discipline or a certain kind of line of inquiry or so on, but it's fundamentally different from that intrinsic process quality.
It can be very challenging for us to determine some of that process quality, in the social science.
Yeah, these ideas have been running in my head, and I really appreciate this distinction between process quality and fitness for use, because I think you're onto something there. So with process quality, the process relies a lot on software these days, right? Some sort of software. So I mean, this is maybe jumping ahead to what this group might do, but engaging with people like the Fair for Research software, how do we assess quality of the software in producing and analyzing data and so forth. And then in terms of the fitness for use, maybe you get a scorecard for the quality of the data, and you take that at face value. But in reality, most of our researchers, when they want to work with the data, they have to spend a lot of time just making sense of it, cleaning it, organizing, and all of that. So another potential area might be standardizing or somehow mapping these kind of curation processes, curation, cleaning, I don't know what to call them, organizing, to make the data of a quality, at a certain level that I can actually use it, to make it usable.
That's pretty That's a pretty interesting discussion. So I have a reflection on that, but Arafat.
Yes, I spent last week working in Norway with the people who sort of disseminate the European social survey data. We're doing a prototype where the workflow of the data being produced is being completely documented, including links to information about the computing environments and the scripts that were executed on the inputs, as well as metadata and access to the inputs. And honestly, beauty is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to fitness for use. I can't say, here's a scorecard. That's meaningless, as you say. What the researcher wants to know is, what am I looking at? And that means understanding where did it come from and what did you do to it? And to me, the key component in data quality is detailed provenance around the sourcing and processing of the data. And a lot of that is not logical, which is difficult to describe sometimes. But when you look at the code, you can see how they implemented it. I think that, providing that information to the researcher is the best way to support data quality, but it's really expensive and complicated to do. And so it's a hard equation, but I think that's really where the answer lies. And that's kind of, I think, what you're talking about. There's a lot of work going on in describing that kind of provenance.
That's the group.
There's a bunch of different groups that work on it.
Yeah, so look, I think what we're hearing from this is I'm going to push the conversation forward because as it's nicely we've kind of got to where we wanted to. So I'm not too worried about where we, the process we use, but the point being there is, you can see there's already a basis for, I think we can kind of build on a couple of discussions that are about, certainly around the quality theme of where we might go next in some of those, and it does feed into a couple of other ideas that that we've kind of got there as well. I do want to pick up on some of the other possible areas of what next. So I will push the conversation there, but I think there's quite clearly from the from what we've seen here, it continues to be that's likely to be a basis of one of the key activities that we have there. So let's move forward, and I'll say we did have a discussion in Q&A so far, but just a point to say to reflect on here. This is kind of the summary. You've already heard this essentially from kind of where we think we're at. Reflecting back on our original purposes, and taking on board. There might be some, continue to be some policy discussions that there's a lot to say, a lot coming through RDA. The other challenge on the data policy side that we've had is capacity constraints. This one particularly requires a breadth of engagement that it probably is not viable. So in a sense. It's partly leaving it to RDA, but it's sort of seeing what with RDA was emerging here was quite clearly a mechanism through which we could provide input in that basis. So trying to do too much more in that space was always going to be a little bit difficult. So in a sense, that's part of our argument for thinking, look, if we're thinking about the efforts, the relevant efforts that are there, probably in terms of investment of time and energy. That's probably not, the return on investment is probably going to be lower than for some of the other activities. Because partly it's not just, our sense is there's not really a social science policy, exclusive domain to really be dealing with. It really has having to feed into some of those cross-domain, cross-national efforts that are there. And there is a capacity constraint, for the question that's there. On the sensitive data side, is there more work to be done there? Our sense is probably that the interest group is there, got the coverage of multiple domains. There might be more within domain work to be done here. So for several folks in this room, that work is already starting to happen. So there's probably some space there, but it really seems to be certainly the data quality continues to be a core part of the discussion going forward. I do take on board that point though about where has the impact been so far and what spaces might left to fill, but that in a sense is a question for what next. And that was the point of today, and career as well, is to reflect upon kind of what spaces we've filled so far, and as a group and as a social science community, what spaces do we want to continue to move into that may not have been addressed. Fundamentally. Oh, that's the slide we've got. What should be the future direction for the group? Our sense is probably, continuing, to move into that, discussion on data quality, continue to work in that. So sensitive data and data policy largely now sit embedded within, at least to some degree, and within RDA itself. So we do think we've achieved, at least some part of that work. So looking at monitoring and participation really is kind of the engagement role here going forward, and then continue to contribute to collaborative efforts there. Probably is the emphasis there. We're open to discussion there. But that's sort of our as chair sort of our initial assessment there. What it does do is to leave open new areas for consideration here. And what might be some of those new thematic areas is there new things to be done? So we think just focusing on data quality is obviously is of interest, but it's probably not the only thing we want to be thinking about here. And I'm going to surprise John here a little bit, which is John went and had a nap in the last hour. And so in that time, I came up with all the things to do. No. Essentially, this is a summary. This is just some ideas. John was struggling rather badly with jet lag, which is, again, as the person who flew 36 hours, I'm not very sorry for John, but he had a bad night's sleep, quite bad. He's had 4 hours and 2 days, so he is genuinely struggling. But this was just some thoughts here about what might be some possibility, and I didn't save the line version actually had qualitative data underneath the fair and social science.
I was going to say, Steve.
It's always implicitly there.
Yeah, well, yes. I think I must have said the last version. So the bottom underneath fair and social science, qualitative has continued to be a theme that's been there. But from experience, I started working on. Arafat and I were in a meeting in 2010 here in Gothenburg, where there was a DDI qualitative data working group. So it's been 13 years, and we continue to,
Was this Lindsay Poirier and Mike Fortune?
Certain things have emerged. A lot of things have emerged in that period, but there is a chance to continue some of that work.
Did you see Naomi Bettencourt's presentation at Eddie?
No,
Steve? Because she's done some remarkable work in terms. It's mostly about discovery of qualitative data.
Yeah.
She's a person, if we wanted to get serious about quality, I think there are people we could reach out to who would engage pretty readily, even on the more detailed discussion of beyond the discovery capabilities.
Yeah. So certainly qualitative would be there. Another one that comes to mind is actually there are now, I've just listed, I'm involved in an Australian National Health Managed Social Sciences coordinate infrastructure through the Australian Research Data Commons. Natasha Simons, who was there this morning from our group. But they say there are now a number of national infrastructures that are starting to come through either in social sciences or social sciences and humanities. I'm aware of the Shock NL. Obviously, there's been Shock Europe. There is now a Shock NL effort that has occurred. ICPSR, I think it's the research data ecosystem, if I got the language right. And there will be others in other. The Future Data Services is up for discussion in the UK. There is probably a question around coordination of social science infrastructures that might be a very interesting topic to be thinking about here. I was trying to think about how to frame Canada in that space as well. Canada is always an interesting case. Canada cooperates. Well, Canada cooperates so very well, it becomes part. But where do we get where the connection is there is always an interesting choice. But there is John and I both work with the Dataverse community and Borealis as one space that might be relevant there. So that might be one. Again, we're kind of looking at what might be some new themes, and we don't have to agree today. But the point being is there are some possibilities there. Another one is I know in SICT did some work on some specific. The European Social Survey and fair and social science specifically, as an example, there some work to be done there. Another one that's relevant to the sort of the World Fair group that I and CoData and others are involved in is just thinking about data integration within and between the social sciences and X. Pick your favourite terminology X here, and that kind of flows from the data quality discussions we were just having. Is to be able to connect things up here, at least to be able to provide some assessment of quality. Those are possible themes that we could certainly be exploring here, and would be interested in sort of looking at potential engagement that exists there. A lot of just the interesting questions in the social sciences, just connecting two social science sources together, and a number of us are working on some of those themes. But within and between might be a starting point for discussion there. Just suggestions though, I'd be interested in sort of, just taking the feel of the room. As say, we've got about 10 minutes left. We have a couple of wrap up, points there, but just to feel the room as to what might, some themes of interest might be here. Because we're
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
that was fantastic. The
Yeah.
voice from above, it's like,
I have been raising my hands for quite some time now, but I think I just come and jump in. Thanks for organizing this. It has been quite fascinating, but my background is genetics and then transited into anthropology. So I just want to come back to the question about quality of data. I think it's, so basically I have 2 points. First of all, when we discuss it, although we are at RDA, but we have to think about how to deliver our message to the wider social sciences community. And so that comes to the second point about data is just a part of knowledge, right? So data is not knowledge, is not science, is not that is useful for society. So when we talk about the quality of data, do not confuse that with the quality of research. And we need to think about the possible users of our data. So we should not only think about us as researchers or policymakers who may use like scalable data that produce kind of policy, evidence-based policy, but we need also to think about the participants that kind of involved in our research and build this partnership with us. So I'm talking more maybe from qualitative research, but also I think some of you in the room mentioned from historical archives and memories and those very human things. So when that is at stake, it's more than data. And we have to think about that and think about when we share that, when we reuse that, when the data are repurposed for what purpose. So I think there's a lot at stake, go beyond just the quality of data. We need to think about the quality of research and what we use the research and the knowledge that was produced for, and for whom, and for what, and in what kind of time scale. Because I think a lot of things nowadays are happening so fast, and we just cannot say, oh, this is a good quality research. It may not the other day. And also we talk about like social media data, right? Are we talking about text? And what about now we talk about deep fake, right? We talk about multimedia. And if that data is included into our database, how we can distinguish true or false and then assess the quality of the data. I think there's just so much, and we need to really slow down and asking ourselves what we are doing this for, and for whom, and for what, and in what kind of time scale. Thank you.
Just reflecting a little bit on that, John. Yeah.
So I wonder, listening at the direction we're going, that maybe a working group that put together these principles of for who, why who, why we're doing what we're doing. What are the principles for engaging with social science researchers and the social science repository community for quality of data? What do we mean? I mean, let's think about our principles there, and at the same time, maybe use that as a jumping off point to address that question of what impact are we having in the social science community? Do we need to, who's not in the room? That question, who's not in the room? Who do we need to go get to pull into the room to come up with that list of principles? We have a wide range of experience in the room, but there's much wider out there that are not in the room. So I wonder if we're looking towards a working group around the data quality with the first thing is start with the principles, slow down. What are the principles? And then start thinking about how do we apply those in which areas? Just an idea.
I guess the other thing that was coming to mind, I'll take Darren's comment first because you may give the answer.
Yeah, I think slightly differently about this problem. I think it is important to define problem statements and define principles, but I think all I hear at the moment is endless exhortations to think about it, to consider the wider questions. But, maybe as another strand of work, we should start defining some use cases and extrapolate some principles from that. Otherwise, I mean, the exhortation to slow down, I'm a bit sceptical about, because we've been talking about this for 20 years. And, I don't know that we've reached many more conclusions other than we really need to think about that some more. So I think it's really important, possible of areas of interest, to actually define some next generation use cases, essentially, just Occam's razor. What can researchers not do now that they really need to be able to do, and work backwards from there? Otherwise, it does, RDA is here, people aren't at RDA, but just because we can't solve all of the problems for all of the people in all of the communities doesn't mean we can't focus on some. So, it's really just a plea to, start being a bit more empirical about some of this stuff, rather than, endless cycles of recursive questioning.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other part I would think about there is there are some spaces already in the, particularly part of what was just reflected on there, I think, is the sensitive data discussion fundamentally about, I mean, that does feed into those questions around understanding sensitivity of purpose and, and projects that come in the mix there. I think you can embed some of that work in just that sensitive data activity. It's not the only limitation of there. I guess from a chair's point of view, I would raise concerns about thinking about assessments of research quality. We're just not in the space to be able to do that. To be clear, that's a much broader program of activity than I think is the remit of this group. Assessing, thinking about data in the context of research is one, but to assess research quality I just think is out of scope. To be clear. So the reason being is that's just a much broader, set of considerations that I think there's simply about the capacity to have. Data in the context of research is probably, and this comes back to this sort of principles question, might be part of the conversations there. Got a comment there, and I think.
I would say saying it's out of scope doesn't even go far enough. I would say that it actually threatens to contravene a lot of the work that we're trying to do in this group. And again, that's one of the biggest obstacles that I have working with anthropologists and other qualitatively minded folks, is that a lot of this is really like braided together with things like research quality, which is often a domain specific or even sub-domain specific conversation that then gets moved across domains, and now you're told that you're not doing good research because of someone else's criteria. So this is a call to back up what you just said, not to go there, because the more in that direction we go, the less of this as a data steward I'm going to be able to do with the researchers that I'm working with, which touches, if I may, on the policy question, which is to say that RDA may be dealing a lot with policy, but is there something that people in this room, and maybe it's just me, can actually say on the record about how questions of research quality and research integrity link or don't link to questions about data quality and the fair data principles? And I know that, it's been revisited by some of the people who've come up with the fair data principles, for example, but I have a hard time selling this idea that these things should sometimes actually not be braided together, both with anthropologists who I'm working with, but also people at the level of national policy in the Netherlands. And I imagine I was talking to Thomas Mixa yesterday about how there's, these two ideas of what the FAIR principles are. One is this kind of hand-wavy policy definition, and one is the very kind of social technical definition, and what we can, again, say as social science researchers about how to understand how this is picked up. And maybe I'm saying a lot of confusing things. No. I guess this was the sort of reflect back on that sort of previous point. There is we're in that monitoring and participation role, as I say, and how we go about engaging in that sort of participation and engagement without kind of drive. I don't think we can drive the agenda. Realistically, but making sure that we have capacity for engagement and and outreach there. I think that does get to part of what you're getting to there, and then where there is specific sort of social science needs there, how do we bring that? And interestingly, I was trying to reflect upon the how do groups go about assessing themselves, which is kind of your point there. There hasn't really been. This might be something to take to the chairs group actually. How do interest groups go back and assess themselves? Is not something I think that has been raised in the in ODA more generally, and it would be worthwhile. 1 second, Erica, we've got a question back.
More of a comment.
Yeah.
As sociologists, my name is Monica Marin. I come from Romania. It is my first RD plenary, so everything is new and old to me at the same time. On data integration, for me, it's quite broad. I would link it to data analysis levels, because when I talk to geographers, they say what they need as data integrator and Unicode code identifiers for their databases. And this is also linked to official statistics on Eurostat. And I think this helps us to have a common language and a dialogue with other disciplines, but at the same time to connect to administrative data, which are important for our work. And I think they are not in my case, they are not really used at the value that they can produce, because they are not integrated to the official statistics system. And I would, on data integration, I would support a common topic that would focus on data integrators between key data integrators like local administrative unit codes or something like that, that would help us connect with other sides.
Yeah, I say it was a very broad brush sort of statement I had there, that say we've been spending quite a lot of time on, a number of people here, but yes, there were some clear themes that you could be, just within would be pretty, or let alone the between sort of questions that are there. We've got Arafan, I think you had a follow up, and then the last question, then I'll need to wrap up.
A bit to follow up that comment. What's the difference between fair and social science and data integration within the social sciences and between social sciences?
I'm not necessarily making a distinction between those two things.
You're working in the World Fair, social sciences work package. What could RDA contribute to what comes out of that project? It's a joint co-data RDA project, right? Is there some sort of community discussion around those issues that is effectively the same discussion? Does that belong here?
As I say, it seemed to me that might be a potential activity that would come through there.
I'm just going to reflect on the possible areas of interest you've listed. So from the Canadian context, some of them resonate very strongly with the direction of the funder we are interested in. And so it's definitely infrastructure, absolutely. We did a paper on social science infrastructure, and not surprisingly, what came out of data infrastructure is one of the key areas that we need to focus on more strongly. And I have some suggestions. What might be a Canadian link we can talk about afterwards. The Indigenous resource question is a big focus of interest for us. Of course, it has to be led by or strongly in collaboration with Indigenous groups, so we need to think that through. But definitely when we talk to Indigenous communities, the social sciences loom large. I remember going to meetings on Arctic science, and all people wanted to talk about was the social science elements. So that was a big opportunity. The issue between social sciences and an interdisciplinary work is an important question. But one of the areas where it hits the ground in a very practical way is how do we manage data and the different data management practices between different disciplines when you have interdisciplinary projects. And from our experience, it's still rather ill-defined within social sciences, sort of the accepted good practices for data management. And the other area that's not mentioned here, and I know there's a lot of groups working on it, but is training. Not just training, but data literacy more broadly in areas of the social sciences, and we also fund the humanities to think about both. And I know there is other groups, so I'm not suggesting this group should take that on, but that's an area where I think we can ensure that the social science voice is embedded in the conversations going on about training elsewhere in RDA. And I think that brings it back to what's one of the key purposes of this group. I think it's to say, so what's going on around RDA, and where does a social science voice need, or where could it bring value to that conversation? And if it's not there, can we as a group think about how we can get it there?
Yeah, where's the mechanism for engagement in those different spaces? It would be pretty interesting to reflect on there. And I guess that was, that sort of monitoring and participation question is an interesting one so I think that's one we will take to the chairs meeting, because it's not clear what the mechanism is. It's very much opt-in sort of a model there as to how you go about that. Okay, so I do have to wrap up, so I'll just say just a couple of final things here. We are looking for new coach, let's say based on the conversation today, we'll be looking to sort of bring together a discussion document, from this. I think we've had some clear sort of, points of engagement that are clearly coming through. The Indigenous one is an interesting one because the Hassan Indigenous is actually the Australian case, and how you engage that. So we'll come back and reflect on on that and sort of return something to the group for further discussion. We are looking though, certainly for co-chairs. Ron's concluded his term there. If you are interested, this is not a an autocracy. So John and I do this in our spare time. So we are certainly looking for, if you are interested, please, get in touch because we'd be very keen to bring folks in, particularly from Europe. Just from a geographical point of view, we've kind of got, we're dividing the world up to thirds. No, that's not true. There is a logistic sort of question about thinking about, engagement with different parts of the community in geographic terms as well. So particularly from Europe, there's anywhere is relevant here. How do we go about engagement there? So please just get in touch and let us know. But following from there, I'll just leave our slides, our emails there as a means for getting in touch. Be keen to talk further. Really appreciate everyone's time today and look forward to further participation. I think we've got some really good ideas coming through today. I appreciate everyone joining us. Thanks very much. And I think there's content. And probably something sweet. No. That's yeah. Yes. Yep. Oh yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, I'd be more than happy to have a chat. Yeah, fantastic. I think as long as the recording, I haven't turned the recording off, but as I say. Oh yeah. It's up there. What do you know? Stop. Yep, good to go.